This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Well, hello, thanks for having me here. Nice to see you, and nice to be back after quite a long time, since I was last in Cambridge. As for that, my first contact, in a way, was by a tape. I was probably about 20 at university. During my time at university, not at that time involved with drugs, amazingly, had led me into the territory which made me explore stuff. And the end of that journey was to realize that I was probably a Buddhist. So I was calling myself a Buddhist, but had no interest in groups, or teachers. I just saw the whole notion of teachers and groups as a contradiction in terms, in that what I'd experienced was not possible to be talked about. So how could it be taught? That was the logic. But at work, which at the time was a BBC film cutting room, I was just starting what I thought would be a career at the BBC. I found myself working alongside someone who was a Buddhist and who had a teacher who really tried to drag me along to classes, and I absolutely resisted for months. But he gave me a tape of a talk by Sangharakshita, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I found very interesting, and actually used it to go to sleep. After my first listen but also there was something about that voice and the length of the talk and the enchantment of the theme that's very, very good for getting me to sleep on the little reel-to-reel thing under my bed.
The bardo asleep.
The bardo asleep. And then Steve, he pursued me from where we worked in Ealing Film Studios to Television Centre to Lime Grove, wherever I went, the internal phone would ring and it would be him. Man, when are you coming to meet Banty? Who I thought he said Bunty, but that's a whole other story. So literally to shut him up, I came along in 1970, November, wet night in Notting Hill Gate, a hired room, Sangharakshita, about 30 people in the audience. That was Triratna, a hired room and 30 people. Sakura, the first centre, there'd been a fire. So they'd had that for a year or so. Yeah. So the movement by then was 3 years old, 2.5 years old. And the order was 1.5 years old. There was no sign of an order. I had no sense of an order and didn't discover there was an order for a long time. But my first encounter with Banty was that night, listening to the lecture he gave, The Jewel and the Lotus, from the White Lotus Sutra series. It's a wonderful lecture. But it wasn't enough, for me to...
And Banty, what did he look like? What was he dressed in at that point? Is he in robes or long hair, mutton chops?
Yeah, the whole thing, mutton chops, long hair, fingers with rings, robes. Underneath the robes, a thick sweater, sort of mustard-coloured trousers, shoes, thick shoes. Very strange. These glasses. And when Steve introduced me to him, he just said, and shook my hand, and that was that. And it was only when he started to talk that I just felt it wasn't magical, but there was something about him that had a kind of, he had this sense of just being in his skin, just comfortably, authentically there. And if you listen to the lecture, there's nothing flashy about the beginning. It's just a story of a caravan making its way across the Tibetan plateau and, thieves coming along and stealing stuff. And it's just a little story introducing the theme. And it caught my attention. And, I really valued the lecture. And him, that he obviously had something. But as soon as it was over, I got out and only went back I went back to Wessex, so that's May. Steve, again, just, when are you coming back? So I went to this festival. And on the strength of enjoying this festival occasion, signed up I went along to the Dharma Day festival, all in hired rooms and still very small numbers. And on the strength of that, an advert for their summer retreat, went on it, and that was it.
That's what clinched it
16
then.
days with Sangharakshita leading everything, meditations. He didn't give talks, but he sat next to a tape recorder playing his talks. A lot of people passed on through over the 3 weeks. Communication exercises, meditation.
So Bhante led everything then. Everything. I mean, there weren't order members leading
that year. No, absolutely not. That was by then. Sometimes there were one or two people who would lead things occasionally, but no, Sangharakshita was front and center. He was leading the retreat. He was a presence. There was a Zen monk, Zengo, who had been sponsored by Bhante, I think, to come to England. And he led some sessions, optional sessions of Zazen Shikantaza in the afternoons for those who wanted it. And that's a whole other story. But it was essentially Sangharakshita, us. And as I say, at that time, I was not aware there was an order.
Yeah. So did you have much personal contact with Bhante then? Did you go off for walks with him, have conversation, or was he a bit distant up there at the front, ringing the bell and leading the meditations? And
well, it wasn't like hundreds of people. So he wasn't distant in that way. He was distant because he was leading, because he was older, but he was older but ageless. It's hard to get that one kind of to talk about that easily, because he was both. Some people did go for walks with him. I don't think I did. I had a very strange experience where I just found this little library, and I was sitting there just having a break, just taking the pressure off from the meditation. We did a lot of meditation, and there were copies of the Reader's Digest. And I was sitting, leafing through the Reader's Digest, and he walked in. And it was just me and him in the room. He just sat down opposite me on the other side of the room, this little room, and just looked at me. And I'm sitting there reading, Humour in Uniform, Laughter the Best Medicine, those features they'd have in, trying to look wise and cynical, knowing. And I'd look up and he'd still be looking at me, and it was not a sexual approach. It definitely wasn't that. I don't know, was it an invitation? You got anything? Do you want to ask something? He didn't make the running, and that was his thing. He didn't play social games. If you wanted to be uncomfortable, he'd let you. But I sort of remember that. I don't think during that I must have said something to him. The next year, by then, I did have some conversations with him. It's very hard to say. It's not like I was in awe of him because of some, it certainly wasn't to do with his position in the institution of the FWBO, because the FWBO was just hardly an institution, just this old man with glasses and robes and long hair and, 30, 40 people. So it wasn't that, but as I think, I can't remember if I put this in the book, but when you were with him, you knew you were in the presence of somebody bigger. You may be somebody who lived in a bigger world, or sometimes I put it like a bigger animal, which isn't quite right. But there was,
and was it that? Do you think that sort of attraction of this bigger? Well, you might now use language of a bigger consciousness or something, which attracted you to stay, or was it the other people, or was it him, the man? Was it what he taught or the way he taught?
It was both. We heard, because it was 16 days, and we heard quite a few of his lectures, and they really impressed me, including the White Lotus Sutra series, and some of those, like the myth of the return journey, that story, and how he interprets it. So do listen if you haven't heard it. The way he unpacked that was just a total unfolding of the spiritual life, which I totally got, and totally kind of, oh yeah, he does speak my language, this is my place. And full transparency, I fell in love, at least, with as by looking as it were, with at least 3 women on the retreat. So that didn't hurt in terms of wanting to stick around.
No, for sure.
But there was, something I noticed. I was living with friends from university. I was still at that stage of life where I was living with friends from university, and they were and are talented, interesting people, and we forged a very strong friendship. And yet here, I was I was having friendships and connections of a completely different time, which felt really to the point. And one example was when, at a breakfast time conversation, I can't remember what they were talking about, but I came in with this sort of, when I hear that, I get really worried. And this woman said, you don't look worried. And it was just a moment of being nailed. And it wasn't unkind. But there was just something about the situation that usually, without being, that kind, but it was just a situation that invited authenticity without needing to rest on wit or cleverness
So this was from other Sangha members. This is coming along.
People, Vajradhaka, Dhammadinna, Manjuvajra, Subhuti. Most of the people who were on that retreat and who were, the core people are still around. Still involved. They're
very much our founding members, as you are. So, Bhante has a very particular emphasis and articulation, you could say, of the Dharma. And, I suppose you were there right at the beginning as he was beginning to really expound the Dharma in new ways, particularly for us in the Western world. And sort of, how did that land with you? Because you said you'd already dabbled a bit in Buddhism, but, was there quite a, did it relate to what you'd learned about Buddhism up to that point? Was it different?
Yeah, I think
was it more accessible?
Well, that was the thing.
It
was, we had the White Lotus Sutra series where he sort of unpacks these parables and stories to make them really accessible, to make them relevant to where I was, where we are right now. He also played one of the higher evolution, either of man or of the individual. I can't remember which series, but we heard that as well. And it was a totally different kind of plane of discourse. And yet it was the same thing. It was meeting, if the White Lotus Sutra was tickling your spiritual intimations and intuitions, and the higher evolution series was providing a kind of framework for thinking about how that might be lived and engaged with. And I think all that was new. Up till then, because my starting point had been a sort of absolutely unexpected, and you could argue totally accidental, but very profound no self-experience sitting on a beach. I thought up till pretty much then that the spiritual life would be about finding ways of having that experience again. And just getting the nourishment that came with it. And if I did, which I sometimes did, I'd feed on it for months. It would just put a spring in my step. But it wasn't a path.
No.
I think hearing his first lecture of the Eightfold Path series, Vision and Transformation, where he just talks about, a religious person. It was a quote from James, is it? A religious person isn't someone who has experiences. There's someone who puts those experiences at the centre of their life. And it was like a slap in the face.
And of course, it's what Bhante himself did.
So, I think,
And, on those retreats or, at other classes or other times when you were meeting him, was he then talking about, this movement, now the movement is so vast and so international. You were just a group of people who were coming along and kind of sitting at his feet and imbibing what he was talking about. But how did, when he started talking more about structuring the movement, and you'd been a bit anti-groups and so forth, how did that feel okay to be involved in that?
Yeah, okay. So I got involved, that first lecture was November 70. That retreat was summer 71. Summer 72, same place, same summer retreat. He started to be much more challenging. Like if we asked vague questions in question and answer sessions, he'd throw them back at us. Whereas in the past, he'd always just found a way of making something fantastic out of any old rubbish we threw. In various ways, he was more challenging. And I thought, I kind of almost took it personally that he was feeling impatient with us. And a lot of us felt that. But he was I think he was testing us. He was pushing us forward. Then he went on the sabbatical, just disappeared for a few months, leaving the 2 or 3 order members who by then had emerged and who were around to lead classes for a few months. And there's a wonderful moment. Some of you might know Buddhadasa, but we were having a class and some kids came in off the street, the centre, Pundarika, that was right next to a children's adventure playground. And some kids said, "What have you got these things for?" And Buddhadasa said, "Well, we are members of an order." In that way of his. And they said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Oh, well, most people take just 5 precepts and we take 10. And so very understandably, the kids said, "Well, what are they?" And between the 3 order members in the room, they couldn't quite get them. It was a wonderful moment as an onlooker. So on the one hand, though, I listened to a talk Bhante gave at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara before Triratna was even a twinkle in his eye, and he talks about the movement, by which he meant the movement of bringing the Dharma to the West. In terms of us at that time, it wasn't the big moment, which we can maybe move on to, but was the convention in January 1974.
We'll carry on, yeah.
Well, January 1974, by then there had been in 1973 several ordinations. By then it was obvious there was such a thing as an order, and he'd started to ordain my mates, people who'd been around, usually, just a year longer than me, at Subhuti, Manjavadra, Dhammadinna, Chintamani, others. In January 1974, I got ordained along with 3 other people, and we moved next door in this house in South London from the shrine room into a room where 20 of us and Bhante sat down and held the first convention of the Western Buddhist order. I think maybe 24 of us, just sitting literally on the floor around the walls, and Bhante in an armchair. And during the course of, I think, a long weekend, in which I've devoted a chapter to it in the book, as well as talking about things that we needed as members of the order to kind of go deeper in our practice, he was saying, "Well, I'm not going to be around forever. I'm not planning to carry on doing the teaching. This is over to you. It's time to be thinking about where we could have other centres." Talked about other cities in England. Even talked about going abroad. He transmitted. He transmitted the job, the project.
How did that land with you and your friends? Was it what you felt you'd signed up for?
Personally, I don't think I'd realised that. I was still at that point. I was still at the BBC, still assuming I was hopefully going to have a career that would culminate in you guys having just seen a Pilchick movie. So, and when Parkinson interviewed me, it would just be, I hear you're interested in Buddhism. Yeah. So that was me. But after that weekend, I think, maybe Subhuti, others, we knew we were on the bus, to use the language, the jargon of the time, together. We were a gang, and more than a gang. But I think he gave us coherence, and he gave us this sense of he transmitted the sort of, I suppose, the bodhisattva missionary project, which, and in the talking about opening centres, it was obviously we were going to have to grow into it, in various ways. So it was an absolutely transformative few days. For a lot of us, and Subhuti actually, who was possibly on up with the ideas, ahead of a lot of us, but in conversations we were having when he was reading a manuscript of my book, he agreed. He said that weekend was just an absolute turning point.
And when he talked about the order, I mean, presumably right at the beginning of the order, he had articulated that this was an order which was neither monastic nor lay. But, what do you think? I mean, it's quite clear how it couldn't be a monastic order. There wouldn't be an order, I don't think. But, the lay, we're not lay. So, what did that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean now, even? But particularly then, what did it mean?
Well, I think at the time, because, we'd been around Bhante, we'd heard his lectures, we were very aware of his attitude towards he has had this enormous respect for the Buddhist tradition and, no shortage of critiques of some ways in which it was working in the East. So we were familiar with that. So when he talked in those terms, I think it just sounded like more of the same, that, we're going to have an order that's neither monastic nor lay. It sounded terribly, that makes sense. And we were young. It didn't seem like a big deal. I don't know how deeply any of us thought about it. Yeah. But then as we started to, very soon after that little convention, we were, within, this was January 74. By the end of 1974, I'd not only resigned from the BBC and started the very beginnings of Windhorse Publications, but within a few months, I was moving down to South London to start running what became the Croydon Centre and things. We were doing it, and we were living together, and some people were starting businesses, and we were in our early 20s. So inevitably, issues about relationships, sex, etc., had not gone away. And so it's not like, Bhante was stirring the pot by, that just what had been a kind of an idea, an axiom, a maxim, neither monastic nor lay. In a way, we were trying to work out what that meant for us, but it was on the hoof in real time. And it's not like he made it terribly easy.
Can you say more?
Well, he was stirring the pot. And this is something, that's really hard to quantify in terms of where he stood. How much was him? How much was us? It's the longest chapter in the book as I sort of explore, in a way, that dimension of our history, that how much was him setting us this project. It's not like he tracked it day by day, but he created a sort of an atmosphere, and we collaborated to a greater and lesser extent in trying to create a world in which, to use Bhante's terminology, we tried to keep our relationships at the periphery of our mandala. But of course, it's not easy and straightforward, and in various ways, in various sort of, in a way, quite radically experimental ways, we sort of mucked around in that territory, just trying to work out. It could be, I was a sort of serial, what would you say, a serial heterosexual monogamist for a lot of the time. And that was uncomfortable. It became very uncomfortable to be, in a sexual relationship, not particularly because Bhante was saying things, but quite a few, there were plenty of people around who could become quite zealous. Only a weak man would do a thing like that.
Oh, right.
So we, it was very experimental. I think we had a first crack of it, living in single-sex activities. Which
you were living in communities, and you lived with Bhante at Padmasuri.
Well,
is that a bit later?
That's later.
Yeah.
But, in a way, I'd suggest you kind of, in the book, I've tried to give something of a portrait of that era. And I think Well, it's worth Stephen Batchelor, who read the book in manuscript, in some notes, sort of said he couldn't understand why I'd spent so long agonizing over that chapter of our history. And at first I thought, has he got a point? Because it is a long chapter. It's good, relationships, gender issues, sexuality issues, marriage issues, are all these sort of this palette of controversial areas and difficult, challenging areas. But then I thought, now, Steve, sure, I take your point, but you've not tried to start a Sangha, nor have you tried to start a Sangha that's neither monastic nor lay. And I think, as I say in the book, to be non-monastic was easy.
Yeah.
We started Vajraloka with the intention of it being a single-sex monastic situation. But only a few people wanted to live there. Yeah. If they did, for a very short period of time. So how did you do the other thing? How, as you asked, how do you do not lay?
Yeah.
And in a way, to be fair to us, it was messy and it was difficult. And, a lot of us in various ways behaved quite badly, but we learnt lessons from it. But we gave it a go. I think it's still, behind it, because single sex, celibacy, whatever, all celibacy, all monasticism is a set of conditions for having an intense, full-on spiritual life. And in India, when Bhante, you mentioned the tour, addressing crowds of thousands of people who are living in extended families, kids, marriage, unspeakable to do anything else, still would say to people, to be a Buddhist, you can only be a 100% Buddhist. And he wasn't saying you've all got to become monks and nuns. He was saying, whatever your lifestyle is, how do you turn that into the context for a fully committed spiritual life?
And I think we still work with that today, don't we? How do we? And the movement is very different now. The world is different, but we're still, still working that out individually and collectively.
Yeah, and you could argue, I don't make a big thing of it, but you could argue that there's a whole era where we thought we'd cracked it.
Yeah.
With our single-sex communities and our cooperative businesses. And I can remember going to the States for the first time with Manjivajra and to a big conference of Buddhists, and they thought we'd cracked it when we talked about what we were doing with our sort of semi-monastic situations. They really thought we'd found the answer. And for a while, I think we felt quite triumphalistic about having cracked this thing, for all the pain that nevertheless was still floating around. But times have changed. We've got older. I'm married.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you